Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Shuchandra Ghosh, Professor, Department of Ancient Indian History and Culture, University of Calcutta. The subject is today Indian culture. The topic is Indian polity, and I will be discussing with you the sources of ancient Indian polity. In this module, the focus would be to look at the sources that are being used to understand the nature of ancient Indian polity. Our thrust will be on textual, epigraphic, numismatics and art historical sources rather than the field archaeological sources. So, how the sources are being used for understanding polity will be discussed in this module. Now, to construct a meaningful image of ancient Indian polity, a thorough understanding of the sources is indispensable. In this module, as I mentioned earlier, our focus would be to look at these sources, how these sources are talking about different kinds of administration or talking about the political structure of a particular dynasty. In case of polity, when we choose our sources, our thrust is more on texts. Then inscriptions also help us a lot, and some of the coinages of some dynasties are very important. Art historical material also helps us to understand in some cases where they represent or they are projected as political statement. But the archaeological, for example, the field archaeological materials are not very important to us. So we have to know what kind of sources talk about the political construction or political structure. A holistic study of these diverse sources with a method that critically explores the meaning and the words or visuals may help us in our understanding, even partially, the political organization of early India. Our problem with our sources is that we have paucity of sources, but whatever we have to reconstruct or construct the history. Now, if we look at the history of research or the historiography of ancient Indian polity, we find that in the Oriental and the utilitarian historiography, early India was seen always as a land of philosophers, only excelling in spiritual and mystic thoughts, lacking in political or material speculation, which means the material culture of our country was neglected and Indians were seen as more spiritually inclined. Against this imperialistic ideology, the Indian scholars, whom we normally call nationalist scholars, attempted to understand the polity from the late 19th century onwards. They wanted to show the world that we have a political structure which was like democracy, which was like republic, and that ancient Indians were not only deeply inclined towards the spiritual life. R.C. Dutt, in his article Civilization in the Brahmana period, presented an ideal picture of the king who did justice to all. In 1907, A.C. Das highlighted the existence of limited monarchy, though not absolute. He also pointed out that in cases of local self-government in ancient India in a better form than the British rule. When he is talking of local self-government, it is actually the Chola local self-government which he has in mind. The writings of K.P. Jaiswal between 1912 and 1915 formed a subject of his famous book The Hindu Polity in 1924, and it set a benchmark in this line and were repeatedly used by following generation of scholars. K.P. Jaiswal was deeply a nationalist historian, and when he was talking about the Ganashanghas, the non-monarchical powers, he felt that these were actually the democratic kind of government which was there in Athens. According to Jaiswal, the ancient Hindu political system was partly of republics of the Athenian type and of the constitutional monarchies like Great Britain. Now, there were other scholars who discussed ancient Indian polity, and they were P.N. Banerjee, K.V. Rangaswamy, R.C. Majumdar, Shama Sastry, N.N. Law, R.K. Mukherjee, and so on. But the most impressive among them were U.N. Ghoshal's A History of Hindu Political Theories. Ghoshal rejected Max Muller's and Bloomfield's theory of absence of state in ancient India. This was the reason because they thought that there was no state concept of state, and therefore the political structure was not well formulated. Nationalist scholars tried to prove the superiority of the ancient institutions of India over those of the ancient West. So therefore, deliberate attempts were taken to prove ancient Indian state as secular without discussion on religious aspects of ancient Indian polity. Completely different from these approaches are the works of R.S. Sharma, Romila Thapar, B.D. Chattopadhyay, Herman Kulke, and these genre of historians not only tried to look at the state society from a different angle, but also trace the route from pre-state to state, the transition from pre-state to state, or how there was kind of polity which could be called integrative polity, or whether it goes against the different kind of state structures were put forward by them. Professor Chattopadhyay, basing his arguments on the land grant charters, tried to understand the process of political formation which led to the emergence of regional state structure in the early medieval India, which is generally from 600 to 1300 CE. Now, with this brief background of the historiography, let us look at the category of sources. We can broadly divide them into two categories. Of course, the textual category is much heavier because here we have representation of lot of sources which talks about the Indian political system or about the polity of the kings or political structure of the period. So among the texts we have to read the Vedas, the Dharma Shastras, the Mahabharatas and Ramayana, Puranas, Arthashastra, Kamandaka's Nitishara, Somadeva Suri's Nitivakyamritam, Buddhist and Jain texts, other indigenous texts, and foreign accounts. Foreign accounts were those of the Greco-Romans, the Chinese, and the Arabo-Persian. Among the archaeological, we have a large variety of epigraphic sources which are inscriptions from various genres. Then we have coins and of course art historical material. To begin with the textual sources, of course we have to start with the Vedas. The Rig Veda, as you know, is the earliest among the Vedas which inform us about the early Vedic period. Then we have the later Vedic period, but in this understanding of the Vedic corpus, we can see the transition where we have a transition from Gopati to Mahipati. We can see that how new assemblies were being brought up. So we have assemblies like Shabha and Shamiti. Then we have Bidhata, another very important assembly found in the Vedic literature, and the people were known as Visha, and the entire corpus gives us an idea that how actually the Vedic political structure was being formulated. The Rig Vedic people were moving from one region to the another, so their kind of polity, they were not known as big kings, they called themselves Rajan, and how they were moving from the region of the Indus to the Ganga valley, that is also very much represented in the Vedas, and with this movement the political structure also changes. In the Vedic corpus, as I mentioned, we have this representation of Shabha, Shomiti and Vidhata, and there are, if we look at this corpus, we find that a huge number of times they are mentioned. So you have Shabha and Shomiti for 8 times, 8 and 6 times, Vidhata for 122 times. Again, the Atharva Veda talks about Shabha and Shomiti as the two daughters of Prajapati. So this is very interesting that Prajapati Brahma is represented as the father of these two assemblies. So one was the Shabha and the other was the Shamiti, and the term Shabha denotes both the assembly and the assembly hall. It was restricted to the elect, that is of the Brahmanas and the elders. Common people were not very much a part of the Shabha. And the Shabha also exercised judicial functions. Initially it might have been a clan assembly, but with the passage of time it underwent changes. On the other hand, we have, if you look at Ludwig's writings, it consisted of common people like Visha, and then they were the rich patrons were also there of these assemblies, and they were known as Maghavan. So the Vedic assemblies were also very important in understanding the political structure. Now we'll move into the later Vedic phase, and when we look at the later Vedic phase, the literature, we find again that we have these institutions called Vidhata, Sabha and Samiti, but they are more structured, and then along with the ordinary people we find the presence of king, Shamrat, but interestingly here it is not a full-fledged monarchical structure. In contrast to the tribal chieftainship of the early Rigvedic times, the later Vedic polity witnesses the beginning of the elements of state, the taxation system and the administrative machinery, and which was supported by the introduction of agriculture, stable agriculture. And like we have in the Shatapatha Brahmanas also the mention of the kingdom, and there are a lot of stories in the Shatapatha Brahmana, and in the later Vedic culture we also have the presence of Rajashiya sacrifices, which are one step forward in the formation of a kingdom and statehood. So this information gives us an idea that how there was a complete change or a transition from the Rigvedic to the later Vedic. The next genre of literature that we have to discuss, actually it goes on like Dharma Shastra, then Puranas and the epics. So we have the Dharma Shastras, these are also known as the Dharma Sutras, and these are actually prescriptive or normative texts which inform us about the polity, society, economy and so on. Since they are prescriptive in nature, they talk about the norms, that this one has to do this, the king has to do that. So this kind of normative literature gives us a whole lot of account of the powers and politics of the ruler. Among the Dharma Shastric texts, Manusmriti have to be paid special attention, because the chapter 7 of this Manusmriti talks about Raja Dharma, and Raja Dharma is one point which is discussed in many of the Smriti literature, where a king, how he should behave, what are the protocols of the court, these are all discussed, and from there we can understand. Next comes the epic literature. Epics are huge minds, huge sources for understanding our political system, particularly the Mahabharata. And then Mahabharata has different parvas. The Shanti Parvan of the Mahabharata will be very important for us to understand the political structure, and these will be discussed in details when we are talking about epic polity. Another genre of literature which is very important as a source are the Puranas. Now there are 18 Mahapuranas, and Puranas were not written at one go. So therefore we find that it also gives us stories on one side, and on the other side the Puranas gives us a list of the genealogical table of the rulers. And it so happens that sometimes if you compare the genealogical table of a particular dynasty in a Purana with the epigraphs, they don't tally. But at times there are cases where we have the name from the Puranas, and we know that that person, that ruler is also mentioned in the inscription. For example, we have this Besnagar pillar inscription of Heliodorus, where he says that he goes to the court of Kasiputra Bhagavadra. Now in the Purana we know about a king from the Shunga dynasty who could be identified with this Bhagavadra. So this way we can actually study our sources by a comparative method. We have another source called the Upapuranas, and the Upapuranas were much more local and they were also regional, and here we must mention the name of R.C. Hajra, who has done immense work on the Upapuranas. The next very important category, and particularly for statecraft, the text is Arthashastra. We all know about Arthashastra, and generally Arthashastra's datings also, it is said that you have the second Adhikarana, which is comparable to the Mauryan period, and the later Adhikaranas are much later, of course. This gives us a clear picture of the state. It refers to the 7 elements of the state. The 7 elements are Swami, that is the head of the state; Amatya, governmental machinery; Janapada, territory and population; Durga, which is the fortified settlement; Kosha is treasury; then you have Danda, which is coercive power; and Mitra, that is friend. So these are the 7 elements, and it is said that a state can function, that is a king will be in the center, and he can function when he has the 7 elements with him. So after Arthashastra, it gives us a lot of other information if you go deep into this. Then we have Kamandaka's Nitishara. Kamandaka's Nitishara was originally said to be dated to 800 CE, but there is a new dating now which says that it could be dated between 500 to 700. This is a treatise on politics written in Sanskrit, and it is based largely on the Arthashastra model, but there are some kind of uniqueness to this text, because it discusses political paramountcy and prosperity of the subjects, and it also talks about politics of violence and the reciprocal relationship between the ruler and his anujivis, that is his shamantas. So the courtly culture is very much described in Kamandaka's Nitishara. We have another text called Somadeva Shuri's Nitivakyamritam, that is dated to the 10th century CE. Somadeva Shuri was a patron, court poet of the Rashtrakutas. It was also greatly influenced by Arthashastra, and it draws heavily its subject from the earlier texts, but it can be a very important treatise for understanding early medieval polity. The next, apart from this text, the next genre of texts are the Buddhist and the Jain texts. Buddhist and the Jain texts are not actually religious texts. These texts give us an idea of the states, administration, and then early Pali and non-canonical literature also gives us a good amount of idea about the political system of our ancient Indian period of that point of time. For example, we have this text called Digha Nikaya. Digha Nikaya is so important to us because it clears, and it can be dated around 3rd century BC, and it clearly tells us about the origin of the kingship of the state. It conceives of a happy, peaceful and pure society, an ideal one in ancient times. Gradually then, it talks about the complexities of life, that there were differences within the people, life appeared, and the vices, and there were several problems with which the people were plagued. And so they naturally wanted that there should be some kind of understanding and administrator. So they agreed to choose a leader as the chief, that is the king, a person who was to be considered the most favored, most attractive and most capable. The chosen or elected person would be one who should be, I quote, who should be wrathful where indignation is right, who should censure that which rightly be censured, and who should banish him who deserves to be banished, unquote. Now the people agreed to give him in return a portion of the rice produced by them. So this was a kind of a beginning of a taxation. That was a tribute, a voluntary tribute, and it was said that the person who would be chosen, he will be known as the Mahasammata, that is the great approved one. So all of the subjects are in consonance or in agreement to choose their leader, and here comes a leader who is a Mahasammata. Much before this text, we have Sanskrit treatise or Sanskrit grammatical texts like Panini's Ashtadhyayi, and then for the post-Mauryan period we have Patanjali's Mahavarsha. While the former refers to the existence of Ganashangas, which are often translated as republics, but it is actually not republic. It's a different kind of polity, and the latter throw light on the post-Mauryan administration. For example, Panini talks of the Ganashangas, and he talks about the different people who were a part of the Ganashangas, the Yodhas, and he calls them the Ayudha Jivi Shangha, means the Shangha, the people of the Shangha actually lives on the use of arms. So that is Ayudha Jivi Shangha. Then we have Patanjali's Mahavarsha, where while he is teaching a grammatical rule, he talks about the incursion of the Shakas, the Yavanas, that they are coming and they are actually moving into regions like Saketa, which is Ayodhya, and so therefore the whole political information, the history, can be gleaned from these dramatical lines. And then we know that Pushyamitra Sunga performed 2 Ashwamedha Yajins, so he is known as the Ashwamedha Yajina from, of course, Patanjali's Mahavarsha, and then there is another inscription of Ayodhya inscription of Dhanadeva. So these texts are very important to us. Next comes the Sangam literature. Sangam literature actually can be dated from the 3rd century BC to the 3rd century CE, and there are other literatures also which follows. For example, the Silakpatikaram, the Manimekalai, these follows, and they capture the changing political landscape of the far south, how the land of the Chola, Chera, Pandyas witnessed the transition. So from the Sangam literature we know that the clan-based organization changed to the dominance of the chief, and ultimately leading towards a more categorical structured power, and this is gleaned from this entire Sangam literature. We have like grammatical texts like Tolkapiyam, then Pattu Pattu, and these give us a very interesting insight into the functioning of the state. Now we move on to, from the indigenous literature resources, we move into the foreign accounts. There are a huge number of accounts. We can't go through all of them, but what we find that in this genre we have the Greco-Roman texts, we have the Chinese and the Perso-Arabic literature, and they supply us valuable data on the polity or political structure. So when we talk about the Greco-Roman sources, we have the historians of Alexander's, and then we have Megasthenes' Indica, which is actually lost, and Indica has been collected by 3 persons. One is Diodorus Siculus, other is Arrian, and the third is Strabo. So in their writings we have portions of Indica, and so therefore if you compare, then sometimes there is a discrepancy, but it gives us a huge number of insight into the Mauryan administrative system. Then we have this Chinese text called Siyuki of the Tatang Siyuki, that is written by Xuanzang, and the famous Chinese Buddhist pilgrim who came during the time of the ruler called Harshavardhana. So he gives us a whole idea of the different kinds of principalities that were present, that were there in the Indian subcontinent. He had come to India from the northwest, he entered to Gandhara, and then he was a very respected scholar in the court of Harshavardhana. He studied in Nalanda, came to Bengal, went to Kamrup, and he gives us a huge description of the different kinds and talks about the command of Harshavardhana, the political structure of the kingdom of the Harshavardhana. So his accounts are extremely important for us to understand the political structure. Then we have Al-Biruni, for example, among the Perso-Arabic literature, we have Al-Biruni's India, where he also talks about the Indian subcontinent. It gives us detail about the political structure. Apart from these foreign texts, we have another very important source, and that's the archaeological source. Now, among the archaeological sources, we have the inscriptions, that is the epigraphic sources. Inscriptions can be of various types. So these are like royal proclamations, donative records, land grants, prashastis, eulogies, pilgrim records, and so on. But then we have the first inscriptions, that is the Ashokan inscriptions, which are of a different class. And Ashoka was in direct conversation with his subjects, and we find that Ashoka actually, if you look at the Ashokan inscriptions, the Mauryan political structure is much understood by the use of different people, the different administrative officers, and he talks about spies, Pativedaka, so it gives us insights. Then we have the post-Mauryan period. After the Ashoka Mauryan rule, we have the rule of the foreign powers and of course the local rulers. So the Sunga dynasty starts, and then we have the Yavanas, the Shakas, the Pahlavas and the Kushanas, and they had inscribed inscriptions which gives us an idea of the polity. We can remember here the Kharavala's Hathigumpha inscription, which was, and particularly an year-to-year account. It is written in a linear style and year-to-year account of his kingdom. So we know how Kharavala was ruling his kingdom, how he was going to different areas with his huge army, and what kind of administration he actually foresaw for himself. Another very important inscription is the Allahabad Prashasti inscription that is the Allahabad pillar inscription of Samudragupta, and these are some of the very important specimens from which we can have political information. From the Gupta period onwards, particularly for understanding the polity of the post-Gupta times, inscriptions, that is the land grant charters, they are very important because they are by far the most important data. There were proliferation of land grants in this period, and this gives us a lineage also, genealogical list, and then the talks about the achievements of the rulers and sometimes the kind of administration. So definitely indicates that there was a shift in the attitude also, and there was a necessity for these rulers that they wanted to have legitimation, and therefore they talk a lot about their genealogy, and from this we can understand the kind of political structure they are actually arguing for, unlike in the earlier phase. We now move into coins, numismatics. Numismatics as a source are very important because this is the medium through which the ruler can project himself, his ideologies, and therefore we have coins from where we know that how, for example, there is a coin of Porus, and this coin represents the defeat of Porus in the hands of Alexander. Then if you look at the Kushana coins in the post-Mauryan period, we have lot of the Greek coins also. So if you look at the Kushana coins, then it gives us an idea of the divine kingship of the Kushana rulers, because then we see in these coins the king coming out from the clouds, there is a nimbate around, there is a halo around the king. So therefore the divine character of the king comes out from the coin. A very famous example of the Gupta coin which talks about the political might of the Guptas is the Ashwamedha type of coin issued by Samudragupta. He was the first person to issue the Ashwamedha type of coin, gold coins, where we have on the obverse the horse and on the reverse a lady. She could be the queen or she could be the deity. There is a controversy on this, but the representation of the horse, the sacrificial horse, is very important for us. And because the Allahabad pillar inscription does not talk about Samudragupta's performance of Ashwamedha sacrifice. So this is the only source from which we know that he performed the Ashwamedha sacrifice. Coins also give us comes up with some epithets of the rulers. Deities on coins of the Indo-Greeks and Kushana coins also disclose the relation between religion and polity. The deities chosen by the Indo-Greek kings for representation on coins tended to be those that could be used as symbols of power, such as Zeus, Heracles, Athena. The tribal non-monarchical coins of the Yodhyas, Kunindas, Malavas, Sibis help us to understand their form of governance, which has often been considered as republics, but they are actually, they could be a kind of oligarchy, or as Ramila Thapa says, that it is a kind of a proto-state. Now these Ganashanga type of polity moved from the Punjab region. They came across the Indus and settled mostly in the Rajasthan area. Therefore, in the Rudradaman's Junagadh inscription, he talks about defeating the Yodhyas who were loathsome. So they were an important intruder into the domain of Rudradaman. And then this group called Yodhyas, they have in their coins this epithet Gana. So we have the term Yodhya Ganasya Jaya on the numismatic specimens, and so therefore we know their mode of governmental structure, so that they followed non-monarchical polity. But gradually we find, after interaction with the monarchies, they were moving gradually towards the monarchical polity, and sometimes they use the title Maharaja, which is absolutely of a monarchical polity. During the time of the Guptas, these non-monarchical powers were completely defeated by Samudragupta, and after that we do not hear of them. Coming to the coinage of the Guptas, we find that they throw important light to understand the nature of kingship and administration. The Chandragupta Kumaradevi type coin issued by Chandragupta I bears the testimony of the fact that the Lichavis and Guptas at a certain point of time came close and also made an alliance, and it might be interpreted as a matrimonial alliances. The issue of the Ashwamedha type of coins I have already mentioned is very important, and following Samudragupta, it was Kumaragupta I who also issued the Ashwamedha type of coin, and this reflects a strong monarchical structure of the Guptas. Furthermore, like the Guptas, the post also took deliberate attempts to attribute divine power of the state, which is evident from the coins. So therefore, coins were used or could be used as a political statement. Therefore, and this is highly understood from the Kushana coins also. Now, in the domain of art history, we do not have the large examples or the huge examples that we have in coins, but there are very significant art historical evidences which gives us an idea that how a particular panel or how a particular sculpture can actually project, can actually talk about the political happenings and also about the structure of polity. Here we will talk about the famous Varaha panel of Udayagiri, which is near Vidisha, that is in Madhya Pradesh. And we'll show that in the visual arts there are ample scope for connecting political reality with the representation of gods and goddesses. So this is the boar incarnation, that is the Varaha incarnation of Vishnu, and it is a glowing example because here you can see Vishnu is being represented as very huge. It's a large representation, and all the other human forms are very depicted in a small way. So the might of Vishnu, and then we have Bhudevi, who is very standing, clinging to Vishnu, very close and very delicate, which shows that Varaha has rescued Bhudevi from the onslaughts. So the story tallies well with Chandragupta's own defeat of the Shakas. It tells us that about an act. We know that Chandragupta II, son and successor of Samudragupta, he was the first ruler to have defeated the western Kshatrapas who were ruling in Gujarat region, that is Saurashtra, Ujjaini, and he actually started emulating the western Kshatrapas and issued the silver coins. Samudragupta did not have silver coins, so it was only the gold coins and copper coins. Now Chandragupta II started for the first time the issuance of silver coins. So the Varaha panel was actually talking about an act, and this act relates to his defeat of the western Kshatrapa rulers, which brought him to the pinnacle of glory. So it is in this context that the imposing relief of Varaha at Udayagiri was created. Whenever we see an art object, it is very important to understand the context of the object. Chandragupta II indeed rescued the earth from the clutches of the enemies, like the boar-shaped Vishnu rescued Bhudevi. So in this image, one can also bring in the inscription in Udayagiri cave 2, where it is said that he was here in Udayagiri with the intention Krishna Prithvi Jayarthena, that he wanted to actually win over the entire Prithvi, that this entire world, and that was reflected in this image, the Varaha panel. Again, secondly, from the Gupta period only, we have, if you go to Lucknow Museum, we have a larger than life sculpture of horse carved out of beige sandstone, and it has been found from Khairigarh in UP. It is now housed in the Lucknow State Museum. This horse is said to be a replica of Samudragupta's Ashwamedha horse, and there are some inscriptions also written, some in Brahmi and some in shell script or ornamental Brahmi. So it has been suggested that this horse represents the sacrificial horse, as I mentioned, and it was used in one of the sacrifices, and this representation of Ashwamedha has also been found in the coins of Kumaragupta first. So this might be an instant of the show of power by an apex political authority. Therefore, images were being used as political statement, and there is another very interesting example about the position of the Lord Tripurantaka. Gerd Mavison has done a wonderful work on this, and we find that the placing of an image in a particular temple becomes very important. Here we find that in case of Rajashingheshwara temple, the Pallava ruler placed all the Tripurantaka images towards the direction of his main enemy, the early western Chalukyas located in northwestern Deccan. So the Chalukya, it gives us an indication of the Chola Chalukya struggle. So since the Chalukyas were in northwestern Deccan, so Tripurantaka image was looking at northwest so that they could be defeated. Then again we find that in case of Rajarajeshwara temple, the Tripurantaka images face all directions, which can be indicated as Rajaraja's well-known claim of paramount overlordship. At Darasuram, Rajendra Chola II constructed the monumental stone chariot of Tripurantaka with his movement from north to south as a last great effort to regain control over his southern enemies. Thus, Tripurantaka images were introduced as a political statement by these rulers. So what we find from, if we look at these sources, it helps us to trace the changing scenario of ancient Indian polity through the lens of this variety of sources. The immense importance of inscriptions and coins for sketching the outline of ancient Indian polity demands special attention in this regard. Normally, we have a tendency to look at mainly the textual sources, but it is also important for us to look at the inscriptions, read the inscriptions between the lines and find out what is written, not explicitly but implicitly within the written words. Literary text of course helps us to comprehend the same scenario, but that should be consulted with a bit of caution as they were put to writing much later, and moreover there is a problem of dating literary texts. Most of the textual texts are very difficult to date, whereas in inscriptions we find that we have the paleography, or in some cases the inscriptions are dated inscriptions. So here, and if we look at the art history, then we find that there is also a possibility of political expression in religious arts. So therefore, it is important to understand the nature of the sources. Sources can be looked at from different perspectives and read from different perspectives. So therefore, for an thorough understanding of ancient Indian polity, each of the sources and with their correlations with other sources should be understood and studied. Now, these are in a nutshell some of the sources that I have discussed with you here, but if you go through the e-text, you will find that each and every sources are discussed in a little more detailed manner, and from that you can construct or have an idea of how to use the sources. And sources, remember, are not one-sided. It gives you many stories. So we have to understand and read the stories properly to reconstruct a proper history of ancient Indian polity. Thank you.